Chapter 3 The Murder. Tuesday, September 11, 8:30 a.m. It was barely 8:30 on the momentous morning of September the 11th when Markham brought word to us of the event. I was living temporarily with Vance at his home in East 38th Street, a large remodeled apartment occupying the two top floors of his beautiful mansion. For several years I had been Vance's personal legal representative and advisor, having resigned from my father's law firm of Van Dine, Davis & Van Dine to devote myself to his needs and interests. His affairs were by no means voluminous, but his personal finances, together with his numerous purchases of paintings of objets d'art, occupied my full time without burdening me. This monetary and legal stewardship was eminently congenial to my tastes, and my friendship with Vance, which had dated from our undergraduate days at Harvard, supplied the social and human element in an arrangement which otherwise might easily have degenerated into one of mere drab routine. On this particular morning I had risen early and was working in the library with Curie, Vance's valet and majordomo, announced Markham's presence in the living room. I was considerably astonished at this early morning visit, for Markham well knew that Vance, who rarely rose before noon, resented any intrusion upon his matutinal slumbers, and in that moment I received the curious impression that something unusual and portentous was toward. I found Markham pacing restlessly up and down, his hat and gloves thrown carelessly on the center table. As I entered he halted and looked at me with harassed eyes. He was a moderately tall man, clean-shaven, gray-haired, and firmly set up. His appearance was distinguished, and his manner courteous and kindly. Beneath his gracious exterior there was an aggressive sternness, an indomitable, grim strength that gave one the sense of dogged efficiency and untiring capability. "Good morning, Van," he greeted me with impatient perfunctoriness. "There's been another half-world murder, the worst and ugliest thus far." He hesitated and regarded me searchingly. "You recall my chat with Vance at the club the other night? There was something damned prophetic in his remarks, and you remember I half promised to take him along on the next important case. Well, the case has broken with a vengeance. Margaret Odell, whom they called the Canary, has been strangled in her apartment, and from what I just got over the phone, it looks like another nightclub affair. I'm headed for the Odell apartment now. What about rousing out the sybarite?" "By all means," I agreed with an alacrity which, I fear, was in large measure prompted by purely selfish motives. The Canary! If one had sought the city over for a victim whose murder would stir up excitement, there could have been but few selections better calculated to produce this result. Hastening to the door, I summoned Curie, and told him to call Vance at once. "I'm afraid, sir," began Curie, politely hesitant. "Calm your fears," cut in Markham. "I'll take all responsibility for waking him at this indecent hour." Curie sensed an emergency and departed. A minute or two later Vance, in an elaborately embroidered silk kimono and sandals, appeared at the living room door. "My word," he greeted us, in mild astonishment, glancing at the clock. "Haven't you chaps gone to bed yet?" He strolled to the mantel and selected a gold-tipped Réger cigarette from a small Florentine humidor. Markham's eyes narrowed. He was in no mood for levity. "The Canary has been murdered," I blurted out. Vance held his wax vesta poised and gave me a look of indolent inquisitiveness. "Whose Canary?" "Margaret Odell was found strangled this morning," amended Markham brusquely. "Even you, wrapped in your scented cotton wool, have heard of her, and you can realize the significance of the crime. I'm personally going to look for those footprints in the snow, and if you want to come along, as you intimated the other night, you'll have to get a move on." Vance crushed out his cigarette. "Margaret Odell, eh? Broadway's blonde Aspasia? Or was it Freen who had the coiffure door? Most distressing." Despite his offhand manner, I could see he was deeply interested. "The base enemies of law and order are determined to chivvy you most horribly, aren't they, old dear? Deuced inconsiderate of them. Excuse me while I seek habiliments suitable to the occasion." He disappeared into his bedroom, while Markham took out a large cigar and resolutely prepared it for smoking, and I returned to the library to put away the papers on which I had been working. In less than 10 minutes Vance reappeared, dressed for the street. "Bien, mon vieux," he announced gaily, as Curie handed him his hat and gloves and a Malacca cane. "Allons-y." We rode uptown along Madison Avenue, turned into Central Park, and came out by the West 72nd Street entrance. Margaret Odell's apartment was at 184 West 71st Street, near Broadway, and as we drew up to the curb, it was necessary for the patrolman on duty to make a passage for us through the crowd that had already gathered as a result of the arrival of the police. Fethergill, an assistant district attorney, was waiting in the main hall for his chief's arrival. "It's too bad, sir," he lamented. "A rotten show all around. And just at this time." He shrugged his shoulders discouragingly. "It may collapse quickly," said Markham, shaking the other's hand. "How are things going? Sergeant Heath phoned me right after you called, and said that, at first glance, the case looked a bit stubborn." "Stubborn?" repeated Fethergill lugubriously. "It's downright impervious. Heath is spinning round like a turbine. He was called off the Boyle case, by the way, to devote his talents to this new shocker. Inspector Morn arrived 10 minutes ago, and gave him the official imprimatur." "Well, Heath's a good man," declared Markham. "We'll work it out. Which is the apartment?" Fethergill led the way to the door at the rear of the main hall. "Here you are, sir," he announced. "I'll be running along now. I need sleep. Good luck." And he was gone. It will be necessary to give a brief description of the house and its interior arrangement, for the somewhat peculiar structure of the building played a vital part in the seemingly insoluble problem posed by the murder. The house, which was a 4-story stone structure originally built as a residence, had been remodeled, both inside and outside, to meet the requirements of an exclusive individual apartment dwelling. There were, I believe, 3 or 4 separate suites on each floor, but the quarters upstairs need not concern us. The main floor was the scene of the crime, and here there were 3 apartments and a dentist's office. The main entrance to the building was directly on the street, and extending straight back from the front door was a wide hallway. Directly at the rear of this hallway, and facing the entrance, was the door to the Odell apartment, which bore the numeral 3. About halfway down the front hall, on the right-hand side, was the stairway leading to the floors above, and directly beyond the stairway, also on the right, was a small reception room with a wide archway instead of a door. Directly opposite to the stairway, in a small recess, stood the telephone switchboard. There was no elevator in the house. Another important feature of this ground floor plan was a small passageway at the rear of the main hall and at right angles to it, which led past the front walls of the Odell apartment to a door opening on a court at the west side of the building. This court was connected with the street by an alley 4 feet wide. In the accompanying diagram, this arrangement of the ground floor can be easily visualized, and I suggest that the reader fix it in his mind, for I doubt if ever before so simple and obvious an architectural design played such an important part in a criminal mystery. But its very simplicity and almost conventional familiarity, indeed, by its total lack of any puzzling complications, it proved so baffling to the investigators that the case threatened, for many days, to remain forever insoluble. As Markham entered the Odell apartment that morning, Sergeant Ernest Heath came forward at once and extended his hand. A look of relief passed over his broad, pugnacious features, and it was obvious that the animosity and rivalry which always existed between the detective division and the district attorney's office during the investigation of any criminal case had no place in his attitude on this occasion. "I'm glad you've come, sir," he said, and meant it. He then turned to Vance with a cordial smile and held out his hand. "So the amateur sleuth is with us again?" His tone held a friendly banter. "Oh, quite," murmured Vance. "How's your induction coil working this beautiful September morning, Sergeant?" "I'd hate to tell you." Then Heath's face grew suddenly grave, and he turned to Markham. "It's a raw deal, sir. Why in hell couldn't they have picked someone besides the Canary for their dirty work?" There's plenty of Janes on Broadway who could have faded from the picture without causing a second alarm, but they gotta go and bump off the Queen of Sheba." As he spoke, William M. Moran, the commanding officer of the Detective Bureau, came into the little foyer and performed the usual handshaking ceremony. Though he had met Vance and me but once before, and then casually, he remembered us both and addressed us courteously by name. "Your arrival," he said to Markham, in a well-bred, modulated voice, "is very welcome. Sergeant Heath will give you what preliminary information you want. I'm still pretty much in the dark myself, only just arrived." "A lot of information I've got to give," grumbled Heath, as he led the way into the living room. Margaret Odell's apartment was a suite of 2 fairly large rooms connected by a wide archway draped with heavy damasked portieres. The entrance door from the main hall of the building led into a small rectangular foyer about 8 feet long and 4 feet deep, with double Venetian glass doors opening into the main room beyond. There was no other entrance to the apartment, and the bedroom could be reached only through the archway from the living room. There was a large davenport, covered with brocaded silk, in front of the fireplace in the left-hand wall of the living room, with a long narrow library table of inlaid rosewood extending along its back. On the opposite wall, between the foyer and the archway in the bedroom, hung a triplicate Marie Antoinette mirror, beneath which stood a mahogany gate-legged table. On the far side of the archway, near the large oriel window, was a baby grand Steinway piano with a beautifully designed and decorated case of Louis C's ornamentation. In the corner to the right of the fireplace was a spindle-legged escritoire and a square hand-painted waste-paper basket of vellum. To the left of the fireplace stood one of the loveliest Boulez cabinets I have ever seen. Several excellent reproductions of Boucher, Fragonard, and Watteau hung about the walls. The bedroom contained a chest of drawers, a dressing table, and several gold-leaf chairs. The whole apartment seemed eminently in keeping with the canary's fragile and evanescent personality. As we stepped from the little foyer into the living room and stood for a moment looking about, a scene bordering a wreckage met our eyes. The rooms had apparently been ransacked by someone in a frenzy of haste, and the disorder of the place was appalling. "They didn't exactly do the job in dainty fashion," remarked Inspector Moran. "I suppose we ought to be grateful they didn't blow up the joint with dynamite," returned Heath acridly. But it was not the general disorder that most attracted us. Our gaze was almost immediately drawn and held by the body of the dead girl, which rested in an unnatural, semi-recumbent attitude in the corner of the davenport nearest to where we stood. Her head was turned backward, as if by force, over the silken tuft upholstery, and her hair had come unfastened and lay beneath her head and over her bare shoulder like a frozen cataract of liquid gold. Her face, in violent death, was distorted and unlovely. Her skin was discolored, her eyes were staring, her mouth was open, and her lips were drawn back. Her neck, on either side of the thyroid cartilage, showed ugly dark bruises. She was dressed in a flimsy evening gown of black Chantilly lace over cream-colored chiffon, and across the arm of the davenport had been thrown an evening cape of cloth of gold trimmed with ermine. There were evidences of her ineffectual struggle with the person who had strangled her. Besides the disheveled condition of her hair, one of the shoulder straps of her gown had been severed, and there was a long rent in the fine lace across her breast. A small corsage of artificial orchids had been torn from her bodice, and lay crumpled in her lap. One satin slipper had fallen off, and her right knee was twisted inward on the seat of the davenport, as if she had sought to lift herself out of the suffocating clutches of her antagonist. Her fingers were still flexed, no doubt as they had been at the moment of her capitulation to death, when she had relinquished her grip upon the murderer's wrists. The spell of horror cast over us by the sight of the tortured body was broken by the matter-of-fact tones of Heath. "You see, Mr. Markham, she was evidently sitting in the corner of her settee when she was grabbed suddenly from behind." Markham nodded. "It must have taken a pretty strong man to strangle her so easily." "I say," agreed Heath. He bent over and pointed to the girl's fingers, on which showed several abrasions. "They stripped her rings off, too, and they didn't go about it gentle either." Then he indicated a segment of the fine platinum chain, set with tiny pearls, which hung over one of her shoulders, and they grabbed whatever it was hanging round her neck, and broke the chain doing it. They weren't overlooking anything or losing any time. A swell, gentlemanly job. Nice and refined. "Where's the medical examiner?" asked Markham. "He's coming," Heath told them. "You can't get Doc Dormus to go anywheres without his breakfast. He may find something else, something that doesn't show." "There's plenty showing for me," declared Heath. "Look at this apartment. It wouldn't be much worse if a Kansas cyclone had struck it." We turned from the depressing spectacle of the dead girl and moved toward the center of the room. "Be careful not to touch anything, Mr. Markham," warned Heath. "I've sent for the fingerprint experts. They'll be here any minute now." Vance looked up in mock astonishment. "Fingerprints? You don't say, really? How delightful! Imagine a Johnny in this enlightened day leaving his fingerprints for you to find." "All crooks aren't clever, Mr. Vance," declared Heath combatively. "Oh dear, no. They'd never be apprehended if they were. But, after all, Sergeant, even an authentic fingerprint merely means that the person who made it was dallying around at some time or other. It doesn't indicate guilt." "Maybe so," conceded Heath doggedly. "But I'm here to tell you that if I get any good honest-to-God fingerprints out of this devastated area, it's not going so easy with the bird that made 'em." Vance appeared to be shocked. "You positively terrify me, Sergeant. Henceforth I shall adopt mittens as a permanent addition to my attire. I'm always handling the furniture and the teacups and the various knickknacks in the houses where I call, don't you know?" Markham interposed himself at this point, and suggested they make a tour of inspection while waiting for the medical examiner. "They didn't add anything much to the usual methods," Heath pointed out. "Killed the girl, and then ripped things wide open." The two rooms had apparently been thoroughly ransacked. Clothes and various articles were strewn about the floor. The doors of both clothes closets, there was one in each room, were open, and to judge from the chaos in the bedroom closet, it had been hurriedly searched, although the closet off of the living room, which was given over to the storage of infrequently used items, appeared to have been ignored. The drawers of the dressing table and chest had been partly emptied onto the floor, and the bedclothes had been snatched away and the mattress turned back. 2 chairs and a small occasional table were upset. Several vases were broken, as if they had been searched and then thrown down in the wrath of disappointment, and the Marie Antoinette mirror had been broken. The escritoire was open, and its pigeonholes had been emptied in a jumbled pile upon the blotter. The doors of the buhl cabinet swung wide, and inside there was the same confusion of contents that marked the interior of the escritoire. The bronze and porcelain lamp on the end of the library table was lying on its side, the satin shade torn where it had struck the sharp corner of a silver bonbonniere. The two objects in the general disarray particularly attracted my attention. A black metal document box of the kind purchasable at any stationery store, and a large jewel case of sheet steel with a circular inset lock. The latter of these objects was destined to play a curious and sinister part of the investigation to follow. The document box, which was now empty, had been placed on the library table, next to the overturned lamp. Its lid was thrown back, and the key was still in the lock. In all the litter and disorganization of the room, this box seemed to be the one outstanding indication of calm and orderly activity on the part of the wrecker. The jewel case, on the other hand, had been violently wrenched open. It sat on the dressing table in the bedroom, dented and twisted out of shape by the terrific leverage that had been necessary to force it, and beside it lay a brass-handled, cast-iron poker which had evidently been brought from the living room and used as a makeshift chisel with which to prise open the lock. Vance had glanced but casually at the different objects in the rooms as we made our rounds, but when he came to the dressing table, he paused abruptly. Taking out his monocle, he adjusted it carefully, and leaned over the broken jewel case. "Most extraordinary," he murmured, tapping the edge of the lid with his gold pencil. "What do you make of that, Sergeant?" Heath had been eyeing Vance with narrow lids as the latter had bent over the dressing table. "What's in your mind, Mr. Vance?" he in turn asked. "Oh, more than you could ever guess," Vance answered lightly. but just at the moment I was toying with the idea that the steel case was never torn open by that wholly inadequate iron poker, what? Heath nodded his head approvingly. So, you too noticed that, did you? And you're dead right. That poker might have twisted the box a little, but it never snapped that lock. He turned to Inspector Moran. That's the puzzler I've been sent for Professor Brenner to clean up, if he can. The jimmying of that jewel case looks to me like a high-class professional job. No Sunday school superintendent did it. Vance continued for a while to study the box, but at length he turned away with a perplexed frown. I say, he commented, something devilish queer took place here last night. Oh, not so queer, Heath amended. It was a thorough job, all right, but there's nothing mysterious about it. Vance polished his monocle and put it away. If you go to work on that basis, Sergeant, he returned carelessly, I greatly fear you'll run aground on a reef, and may kind heaven bring you safe to shore.